BookTube, it's Amy, and I'm here today with An Inland Voyage by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this is my beautiful illustrated edition that I picked up in Kingston over the summer. We've got illustrations by Noel Rook in here, and they are absolutely, well, that one's not so great. That's just the black and white one there. But most of them are absolutely beautiful. They're in color, and they do appear to be perhaps watercolors of some sort. But this is one of 3 travelogues that Robert Louis Stevenson published in his early career. And this is my first kind of foray into travelogues from Stevenson, and I have to say I quite enjoyed it. So in 1876, he and a friend decided to take a canoe journey through parts of Belgium into France. They started in Antwerp and made their way along some of the canals. There was quite a bit of portaging in the early part of their journey, and there was one section where they realized that there were, upwards of 50 locks ahead of them in the next day's journey. And so they just took a train through that section and decided that, it would be a lot of portaging, it would be exhausting. But they made their way along these canals and onto the Ortiz River over the course of several days, several weeks. There's no exact timelines in the travelogue, in the memoir, but you do get a sense that they were at this for probably a couple of weeks here. And both Stevenson and his companion are Scottish. Their names are not mentioned anywhere in the entire book. Or at least in the entire main book. There is an epilogue chapter that was added on in later editions that was not included in the first edition. And it is included in my edition, which is, Stevenson getting stuck in jail for a night somewhere on this journey because he's been mistaken for a beggar and doesn't have the right papers they're looking for. But for the most part, they're only referred to as the Cigarette, which is the name of Stevenson's companion, as well as his canoe. And Stevenson himself is referred to as Arthurium, and that's the name of his canoe as well. But a little peek on the internet told me that the name of Stevenson's actual companion, as opposed to the Cigarette as he's called, was Sir Walter Grindlay Simpson. But they go by nicknames throughout, and it's just an enjoyable travel memoir about a canoe journey. They stop places overnight in some, smaller communities. The locals are absolutely enchanted and interested by them because, these strange men with their India rubber bags, as he calls them, and these canoes, which are, described as canoes, but they seem to be something probably along the size of like a kayak or a small boat, but they do have sheets or tiny sails, as he calls them, that they can use, when the wind picks up in the right direction. But at the same time, it does seem to be a lot of paddling as well. But it's these really tiny boats that are pretty much canoes. And there is, I don't know if you can see here in an illustration, that's more or less what their boats looked like. And I'm assuming the sheets or sails are kind of something they would put on the front. I really wish, if this book had been published more recently, like in the 20th century, I'm sure there would have been photographs of their boats, but there are no photographs. And so I just had to sort of imagine what these boats were. But these little, canoe, kayak boats with tiny sails, and they're proceeding through these rural communities in Belgium, and people are kind of puzzled by them. On several occasions, they're mistaken for peddlers, they're mistaken for beggars, they're denied, hotel accommodations or the right to eat in certain, establishments. Because they come in, covered in the rain, probably muddy and dirty, haven't bathed in a couple of days. And people don't trust that they have money There's one rather amusing occasion where they are let in. They realize that everyone in this town has mistaken them for peddlers, and they just go along with it. It's not, they're not speaking the language in this area to that well of a degree. And they just go along with it, and then sort of they make contact with a real peddler and his family in this, hotel and tavern they're staying in. And they're just, thinking of the marked contrast and thinking about how people are probably perceiving them as being jealous of this apparently wealthier and more successful merchant or merchant peddler who appears to be wealthier than them, but in reality, they're Englishmen, as they said, they're Scottish, but they come from England. And it's only when, people see them leaving in their boats that they realize, oh, maybe we were mistaken about who these guys were. And then when they get to the bigger cities, there's kind of a shift, and they realize they're no longer a novelty, and there's lots of people in boats, and they're nothing but a stranger among a crowd. And Stevenson makes a remark in the book about how, people who appear to be interesting and extraordinary are going to have interesting experiences and be well received, but people who appear to be ordinary and dull are going to have dull experiences. But I quite enjoyed it. There's a few exciting moments. There's one moment where Stevenson's canoe dumps. They're going through a section of a river where there's been a lot of downed trees, and his friend the cigarette manages to sort of skirt around this tree. Stevenson doesn't quite realize there's a way around in time anyway, and so he's coming, head on to this tree across the river, and he realizes it's going to sort of come across his chest. And so he does the only thing he can think to do at that moment, and he kind of hugs the tree and manages to pull himself on top while his canoe goes under, and his canoe goes off down the river, and he's sort of hanging on to this tree, having this, epiphany moment where he's heard the church bells in the neighboring town and start to think about, death and existence. And he seems to have a little bit of a shift in his experience of the whole trip after that. And they visit, churches and cathedrals and makes observations about town life. And then, as anyone would, after a few rainy days, they get very tired of this trip. There's a point where they're not having fun anymore. And, someone even sort of raises an eyebrow, wondering why they're doing this for pleasure if they don't seem to be getting any pleasure out of it. And eventually they do decide, we've had enough. Let's, post our canoes back from whence we came, and let's climb aboard a train. And for the most part, it's a chronological narrative. And then, as I said in my edition, there is an epilogue. And I was a bit confused at first because I had just read this chapter where they had concluded the journey. Stevenson had titled it Back to the World. And then we have an epilogue where he's still using their nicknames here, the Arethusa and the Cigarette. Also, as I said, the name of their canoes. And they appear to be walking on foot. And for whatever reason, Stevenson is ahead of his friend and seems to be not quite as nicely dressed as his friend, and does get picked up by these authorities. It wasn't entirely clear to me where they were at. I think somewhere in France. Certainly the fact that the commissary and the officials are asking him questions in French, which are included in here. And most of them are not translated. Some of them are. But he gets tossed into this prison cell, and it's not until he says, keep an eye out on the road. Please arrest my friend too. And it's not until they, see this friend in much nicer clothes with all these fine books and lots of money on him that they think, maybe this guy isn't who we thought he was. Maybe he's not a beggar or some vagabond who's come to cause trouble. But yeah, Robert Louis Stevenson, An Inland Voyage. I greatly enjoyed it. I think it's going to become a staple of my travel literature rereading. There are some travel literature books I like to reread now and then. And I think it's definitely one to check out if you appreciate travelogues and travel literature, or if you're looking for something additional to read of Robert Louis Stevenson. I know many of us kind of read his most famous works, Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and leave it at that, assuming that he only wrote adventure stories for boys or for children. But he's got a lot of other works out there. As I said, this is one of 3 travelogues that he wrote early in his career. And I'm thinking there was at the back a publisher's list. He's got some collections of essays that I've dipped into. And it looks like some other nonfiction works and fiction works. So in addition to an inland voyage, there's one called Edinburgh Picturesque Notes and one called Travels with a Donkey. And so I think those are 2 that I'm going to be looking out for copies of for myself. Perhaps when I go to the book fair in Toronto later this year, I'll see if one of the vendors has a copy of one of those. But then there's one that interests me too. There's one called A Christmas Sermon, which could be interesting to try around Christmas. And just a whole list of titles that I'm not aware of. And then there's a list of, there's 2 lists here. Those seem to be other authors. And then there's one that called The Dynamiter that says it's written with Mrs. Stevenson. So I know a little bit about Robert Louis Stevenson, but I'm still relatively new to biographical information about him as well as his body of works. But there we have it. We'll leave it at that, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.